The Arizona sun blazed mercilessly over the Chiricahua Mountains, casting long shadows across the dusty trading post where 8-year-old Ayana waited for her father. She sat cross-legged in the shade of a weathered wooden building, weaving grass into small baskets, as her grandmother had taught her, her dark eyes occasionally glancing toward the main road where dust clouds signaled approaching riders. Her father, Nalnish, emerged from the trading post carrying supplies, flour, coffee, and ammunition that would last their small band through the harsh winter months ahead. His weathered face, marked by years under the desert sun, broke into a gentle smile when he saw his daughter. "Ayana, help me load these onto the horse," he said in Apache, his voice carrying the quiet authority that made him respected among their people. As they worked together, securing the supplies to their pack horse, Ayana noticed her father's tension. His movements were more deliberate, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. The year was 1886, and the Apache Wars had left deep wounds between her people and the white settlers, who continued to encroach on their ancestral lands. "Father, why do the white men hate us so much?" Ayana asked, tying down a sack of grain with practiced hands. Nalnish paused, placing a calloused hand on his daughter's shoulder. "They fear what they don't understand, little warrior, and fear makes people do terrible things." The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their conversation. 3 white men rode up to the trading post, their horses lathered with sweat, their faces hard with determination. The leader, a tall man with cold blue eyes and a rifle across his saddle, dismounted and approached them. "You're Nalnish," the man said, his voice carrying a thick accent that Ayana couldn't place. "I'm Thomas Mackenzie. We need to talk." Ayana watched as her father straightened, his hand instinctively moving closer to the knife at his belt. "We have nothing to discuss, Mackenzie. My cattle have been stolen. My ranch hands say they saw Apache tracks leading north." Mackenzie's voice was steady, but there was something dangerous lurking beneath the surface. "I want them back." "We are not thieves," Nalnish replied firmly. "We trade honestly here, as we always have." The tension in the air grew thick as summer humidity. Other people around the trading post, both Apache and white, began to notice the confrontation, some stepping back, others moving closer to see what would unfold. Mackenzie's jaw tightened. "Don't lie to me, Apache. I know your people took my cattle. I want compensation, or there'll be consequences." Ayana felt her heart racing as she watched her father remain calm in the face of the white man's aggression. This was not the first time such accusations had been made, and she had learned that her people were often blamed for crimes they didn't commit. "I will not pay for crimes we did not commit," Nalnish said, his voice carrying the weight of generations of Apache dignity. "If you have proof, show it. If not, leave us in peace." The confrontation escalated quickly. Mackenzie's hand moved to his pistol, and in that instant, Ayana saw her father's expression change from firm resolve to protective alarm. Time seemed to slow as she watched Mackenzie draw his weapon, his face twisted with rage and prejudice. "Father!" Ayana screamed, but it was too late. The gunshot echoed across the trading post like thunder, sending birds scattering from nearby trees. Nalnish stumbled backward, clutching his chest, his eyes wide with shock and pain. Blood seeped through his fingers as he fell to his knees. "No!" Ayana rushed to her father's side, her small hands pressing against the wound, trying desperately to stop the bleeding. Around them, chaos erupted as people shouted and ran for cover. Mackenzie stood over them, his smoking pistol still in his hand, his face showing no remorse. "That's what happens when you people don't know your place," he said coldly. Nalnish looked up at his daughter, his breathing becoming labored. "Ayana, remember who you are. Remember our ways." His voice was barely a whisper. "Don't let hatred consume you." Those were his last words. As Ayana held her father's lifeless body, something fundamental broke inside her 8-year-old heart. She looked up at Mackenzie, who was already mounting his horse, preparing to ride away as if nothing had happened. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and in that instant, both their fates were sealed. Ayana's young face, streaked with tears and her father's blood, was etched with a pain and fury that seemed far too old for her years. Mackenzie saw it too, the promise of vengeance burning in those dark eyes. "I'll remember you," she whispered, her voice carrying a weight that made even Mackenzie pause. "I'll remember everything." As the dust settled and the trading post returned to an uneasy quiet, Ayana cradled her father's body, surrounded by the sympathetic murmurs of their Apache brothers and sisters who had witnessed the senseless killing. But their words of comfort couldn't reach her. In that moment, as the Arizona sun continued its relentless journey across the sky, a warrior was born from the ashes of a little girl's innocence. The seed of vengeance had been planted, and it would grow in the darkness of her grief for years to come. 15 years had passed since that terrible day at the trading post, and Ayana had transformed from a traumatized child into one of the most feared Apache warriors in the territory. The reservation system had forced many of her people into confined areas, but Ayana had chosen a different path, one that led through the mountains and deserts, tracking those who had wronged her people. Now 23, she possessed the lean, powerful build of someone who had spent years moving through harsh terrain. Her long black hair was often braided with feathers and small bones, trophies from her hunts. But these weren't animals she tracked. Ayana had become something the white settlers whispered about in fearful tones, a ghost who appeared without warning, striking swift justice against those who harmed the Apache. On this particular morning, she crouched behind a cluster of red rocks overlooking a small ranch in the New Mexico territory. Her trained eyes studied the layout of the buildings, counting the men, noting their routines. This ranch belonged to the Hendersons, a family that had been stealing Apache children and selling them to distant towns as hired help, essentially slavery by another name. Her companion, an older Apache warrior named Gomda, lay beside her, his weathered face grim as he observed the target. "There are too many of them, Ayana. We should wait for the others." "We've been waiting for 3 days," she replied, her voice steady and cold. "Every day we wait, more of our children disappear." Gomda studied her profile, seeing the same determined fury that had driven her for 15 years. "Your father would not want you to become consumed by this path." Ayana's jaw tightened at the mention of Nalnish. "My father is dead because he believed in peace and understanding. Look where that got him." "And what about Mackenzie? Do you still search for him?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Thomas Mackenzie had become Ayana's white whale, the object of her deepest hatred. Over the years, she had tracked him across 3 territories, always arriving just days or weeks after he had moved on. He had become a rancher, then a businessman, using his profits to buy more land, always staying one step ahead of the justice he deserved. "I will find him," she said simply. "But today we save those children." As the sun reached its zenith, Ayana and Gomda moved with the practiced silence of seasoned hunters. They had learned to use the white man's assumptions against them. Most settlers never expected Apache warriors to strike during broad daylight, assuming they only attacked under cover of darkness. The rescue operation unfolded with precision. While Gomda created a distraction by spooking the cattle on the far side of the ranch, Ayana slipped into the main house, where intelligence suggested the stolen children were being kept. She found them in a root cellar beneath the kitchen, 4 Apache children ranging in age from 6 to 12, their eyes hollow with fear and trauma. "I am Ayana," she whispered in Apache to the frightened children. I am here to take you home." The oldest child, a boy named Kuruk, looked up at her with a mixture of hope and disbelief. "They said no one would come for us." "They lied," Ayana replied, beginning to untie their bonds. "Our people never abandon each other." The escape was swift, but not without complications. As they emerged from the cellar, Mrs. Henderson appeared in the kitchen doorway, her face pale with shock. For a moment, the two women stared at each other across a divide of culture, history, and pain. "Please," Mrs. Henderson whispered, "don't hurt us. We have children too." Ayana could have killed her easily. Her knife was already in her hand, and the woman was unarmed. The old Ayana, the one consumed by pure vengeance, might have done exactly that, but something in the woman's plea, something in her desperation to protect her own children, gave Ayana pause. "Then you should understand why I'm here," Ayana said quietly. She looked at the Apache children, then back at Mrs. Henderson. "If I find that any Apache child has been taken from this ranch again, I will return, and next time I will not show mercy." Nadi. They escaped without violence that day, but the encounter had stirred something in Ayana's soul, a small crack in the wall of hatred she had built around her heart. As they rode through the desert toward the hidden camp where they would reunite the children with their families, Gomda noticed her unusual quiet. "You could have killed her," he observed. "Yes, but you didn't." Ayana was silent for a long moment, watching the rescued children ride ahead of them, their faces already beginning to show relief as they moved farther from their captors. Her fear reminded me of something I had forgotten. What was that? That not all of our enemies are the same. Some are evil, like Mackenzie. Others are just afraid and ignorant. Gomda nodded slowly. Your father would be proud of that wisdom. But even as she spoke of wisdom and distinction, Ayana's heart still burned with the need for justice against the man who had taken everything from her. Mackenzie was different. He had looked into her 8-year-old eyes and felt no remorse, no recognition of her humanity. For him, there could be no mercy. That night, as they camped under the vast New Mexico sky, Ayana received news that would change everything. An Apache messenger arrived with information that made her blood run cold. Thomas Mackenzie had been found. He was holed up in a cabin in the Colorado mountains, badly injured from a bear attack, alone and vulnerable. "How far?" she asked, her voice barely containing her excitement. 3 days hard riding," the messenger replied. "But Ayana, there's something else. He's dying. The bear nearly killed him. If you want your revenge, you need to leave now." Ayana stared up at the stars, her father's face appearing in her memory as clearly as if he stood before her. After 15 years of searching, 15 years of burning hatred, the moment she had dreamed of was finally within reach. By dawn, she was riding north toward Colorado, toward the confrontation that would define the rest of her life. The Colorado mountains in late autumn were unforgiving, with early snow already dusting the higher peaks and a bitter wind that cut through even the warmest clothing. Ayana had been riding for 2.5 days, pushing her horse to its limits through treacherous mountain passes and narrow trails that would have challenged even the most experienced riders. As she approached the remote area where Mackenzie was reportedly hiding, she dismounted and continued on foot, moving with the silent grace that had made her legendary among both her own people and their enemies. The cabin came into view just as the afternoon sun began its descent behind the towering pines, a small, rough-hewn structure that looked like it had been hastily built by prospectors or hunters seeking temporary shelter. Smoke rose from the chimney, a thin grey line against the darkening sky. He was alive then, at least for now. Ayana circled the cabin carefully, noting the lack of horses or other signs that he had companions. Her intelligence had been correct. Thomas Mackenzie was alone. From her position behind a fallen log, she could see through the cabin's single window. The sight that greeted her was not what she had imagined during 15 years of planning this moment. The man who had loomed so large in her nightmares, who had become the embodiment of everything evil in her world, looked small and broken on a makeshift bed near the fireplace. Mackenzie's face was pale and gaunt, aged far beyond his years. Deep claw marks ran from his left temple down to his jaw, and his left arm was wrapped in blood-stained cloth. He moved with obvious pain, occasionally letting out small groans that carried through the thin cabin walls. This was not the imposing figure she remembered from that terrible day at the trading post. For nearly an hour, Ayana watched and waited, studying her enemy, trying to reconcile the pathetic figure before her with the monster of her memories. As darkness fell, she finally made her move, approaching the cabin door with her rifle ready and her knife within easy reach. She didn't bother to knock. The door creaked open on leather hinges, and she stepped inside, her weapon trained on the man who had killed her father. Mackenzie's eyes snapped open at the sound, and for a moment confusion clouded his fevered gaze. Then recognition dawned, and with it a complex mixture of fear, resignation, and something that might have been relief. "You," he whispered, his voice hoarse and weak. "I wondered when you'd find me." Ayana stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the snowy landscape behind her, her rifle steady in her hands. "Thomas Mackenzie." "Yeah, that's me." He tried to sit up, but grimaced in pain and settled back against his crude pillow. "You're the Apache girl from the trading post, Nalnish's daughter." The sound of her father's name on his lips sent a surge of rage through Ayana's veins. "You remember his name?" "I remember everything about that day." Mackenzie's eyes fixed on hers, and she was surprised to see something she hadn't expected: guilt. "I've remembered it every day for 15 years. Ayana stepped further into the cabin, her weapon never wavering. The interior was sparse and cold, with only the most basic supplies scattered about. Medical supplies suggested he'd been treating his wounds himself with limited success. "Good," she said coldly. "Then you know why I'm here." Mackenzie nodded slowly. "To kill me." "Can't say I blame you." He gestured weakly toward his injuries. "Though it looks like that bear might have saved you the trouble." "No." Ayana's voice was firm. "You don't get to die from some animal attack. You die by my hand for what you did to my father." For several minutes they stared at each other across the dim cabin. The fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on the rough wooden walls. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, carrying the promise of a harsh winter storm. "Can I ask you something?" Mackenzie said finally. Ayana's finger tightened on the trigger. "You can ask." "What kind of man was he? Your father?" The question caught her off guard. Of all the things she had imagined Mackenzie might say in his final moments, asking about Nalnish had never occurred to her. "Why?" she demanded. Mackenzie closed his eyes for a moment, pain evident in every line of his face. "Because I need to know. I need to understand what I took from the world that day." Despite herself, Ayana found herself answering. "He was kind. He believed in peace between our peoples. He taught me to weave, to track, to understand the language of the desert." Her voice grew stronger as she spoke. "He never raised his hand in anger against anyone. He traded fairly with whites and Apaches alike. He was respected by everyone who knew him." Mackenzie was quiet for a long time, absorbing her words. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "And I killed him over some stolen cattle that were probably taken by rustlers, not Apaches." "Yes." The word came out like a blade. "I was angry that day. My wife had just died of fever, and I was looking for someone to blame, someone to hurt the way I was hurting." Mackenzie's breathing became more labored. "That doesn't excuse what I did. Nothing could excuse that. But I want you to know that I knew I was wrong, even as I pulled the trigger." Ayana stared at him, her world suddenly tilting off its axis. For 15 years, she had carried the image of Mackenzie as a heartless monster who killed without conscience. This broken, remorseful man before her didn't fit that narrative. "You're lying," she said. But even as she spoke the words, she could hear the uncertainty in her own voice. "I'm dying, girl." "What would be the point of lying now?" Mackenzie's eyes met hers again. "I've spent 15 years trying to make up for what I did that day. I helped build schools for Apache children. I gave money to families displaced by the wars. I tried to become the kind of man your father was. That doesn't bring him back. No, it doesn't." Mackenzie's voice broke slightly. "And it doesn't give you back your childhood or heal the pain I caused you." Ayana's hands began to tremble almost imperceptibly. This was not how she had imagined this moment would go. Where was the satisfaction she had expected? Where was the righteous fury that had sustained her for so many years? "I should kill you now," she said. But the words lacked the conviction she had carried with her on the long ride to this cabin. "Yes," Mackenzie agreed, "you should. You have every right." He paused, seeming to gather his remaining strength. "But I have to ask you for something first." "You have nothing to ask of me." "Mercy." The word hung in the air between them like a prayer. Ayana felt as if she had been struck by lightning. Of all the words he could have spoken, this was the one she was least prepared to hear. "Mercy," she repeated, her voice incredulous. Mackenzie nodded weakly. "Not for me. I know I don't deserve it, but for you. Don't let what I did to your father make you into something he wouldn't recognize. Don't let my crime poison the rest of your life." Outside the cabin, the wind grew stronger, rattling the windows and causing the fire to flicker. Inside, two people sat in the growing darkness, separated by years of pain and hatred, but somehow, in that moment, connected by their shared humanity. Ayana lowered her rifle slightly, confusion and conflict warring in her heart. The choice that would define her legacy was upon her, and for the first time in 15 years, she wasn't certain what that choice would be. The storm that had been threatening all day finally broke just after midnight, sending sheets of snow and ice against the cabin walls. Ayana had spent hours sitting across from Mackenzie, her rifle resting across her knees, watching him drift in and out of fevered sleep. Each time he woke, their eyes would meet, and the weight of unfinished business would settle over them both like a heavy blanket. As the hours passed, Mackenzie told her more about the years following her father's death. How the guilt had eaten at him, driving him to drink and violence until he nearly lost everything. How he had slowly tried to rebuild himself into something better, though he knew it could never undo the damage he had caused. "I found out about you, you know," he said during one of his more lucid moments. "Word travels, even out here. They call you the Ghost Warrior. Say you've saved dozens of Apache children, that you strike fear into the hearts of men who would harm your people." Ayana said nothing, her dark eyes reflecting the flickering firelight. "Your father would be proud of who you've become," Mackenzie continued, "even if he might question your methods." "Don't pretend to know what my father would think," Ayana snapped, but there was less venom in her voice than before. Mackenzie nodded, accepting her rebuke. "You're right. I forfeited any right to speak for him when I pulled that trigger." He paused, struggling to sit up straighter. "But I can tell you what I think he'd want for you. I don't care what you think. He'd want you to be free, Mackenzie pressed on, ignoring her protest. Free from the hatred that's been driving you all these years. Free to live for something more than vengeance. The fire popped loudly, sending sparks up the chimney, and both of them flinched slightly at the sound. The storm outside seemed to be growing more intense, and Ayanna realized they might be trapped together for days if the weather didn't improve. "You want to know something funny?" Mackenzie said, his voice growing weaker. "I used to dream about this moment. About you finding me. Sometimes you'd kill me quickly, sometimes slowly, but I never imagined this." "What? You dying slowly from bear wounds instead of my bullets?" "No. I never imagined that when the time came, I'd be more worried about what killing me would do to you than what you'd do to me." Ayanna stood abruptly, pacing to the small window to stare out at the swirling snow. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. Despite everything, she found herself checking the fire and adding more wood to ensure the cabin stayed warm enough to keep them both alive through the night. "Why did you do it?" she asked suddenly, turning back to face him. "The real reason, not the cattle, not your grief. Why did you choose to pull that trigger?" Mackenzie was quiet for so long that she thought he might have fallen asleep again. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I was afraid." Afraid of what? Of change. Of a world where Apache and White could trade together, work together, maybe even live together in peace. Mackenzie's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Your father represented something I wasn't ready for. A future where the old hatreds didn't matter anymore. And I was too small, too damaged, too proud to let that future happen." Ayanna felt something shift inside her chest, like ice beginning to crack on a frozen river. "So you killed him to keep your hatred alive?" "I killed him because I was a coward," Mackenzie admitted. "And I've been trying to become brave enough to face what I did ever since." The admission hung between them, raw and honest, in a way that caught Ayanna completely off guard. She had expected many things from this confrontation: rage, defiance, even fear. But this quiet, broken honesty was something she hadn't prepared for. As dawn approached, Mackenzie's condition worsened noticeably. His breathing became more labored, and his skin took on a grayish pallor that suggested his time was running short. The bear's claws had done more damage than either of them had initially realized, and infection was setting in despite his attempts at treatment. "I'm not going to last much longer," he said matter-of-factly, as pale morning light began to filter through the cabin's small windows. Ayanna looked at him, this man who had defined her life for 15 years, and felt an unexpected pang of something. Not sympathy exactly, but perhaps understanding. "No," she agreed, "you're not. Will you stay with me?" The request was simple, vulnerable in a way that stripped away years of accumulated hatred. Ayanna considered the question. She could leave now, let him die alone as he probably deserved, or she could end his suffering quickly with her knife. Both options had merit. Both would give her a form of justice. But as she looked at this broken, dying man, she realized that what she wanted had changed somewhere during the long, storm-filled night. The burning need for revenge that had sustained her for so long was still there, but it was no longer the only voice in her heart. "I'll stay," she said quietly. Over the next few hours, as Mackenzie drifted closer to death, they talked about many things. He told her about his wife, about the ranch he'd built and lost, about the children he'd helped through his years of attempted atonement. She found herself sharing memories of her father that she hadn't spoken aloud in years. His laugh, his patient hands teaching her to weave, the stories he would tell about the old days when the Apache roamed free across the entire Southwest. When the end came, it was peaceful. Mackenzie's breathing simply grew shallower and shallower until it stopped altogether. His last words were an apology, spoken so softly that Ayana had to lean close to hear them. "I'm sorry, for everything, for the man I was, for the pain I caused, for the years I took from you." And then he was gone. Ayana sat beside his body for a long time, watching the storm finally begin to clear outside the cabin windows. She had imagined this moment countless times over the years, but the reality was nothing like her expectations. There was no surge of triumph, no sense of completion or justice served. Instead, she felt empty, hollow in a way that had nothing to do with hunger or exhaustion. The man who had killed her father was dead, but she hadn't killed him. The revenge she had lived for had slipped through her fingers like water, replaced by something far more complex and difficult to understand. As she prepared to leave the cabin, Ayana made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of leaving Mackenzie's body for scavengers, she spent the day digging a grave in the rocky soil behind the cabin. It was hard work, made more difficult by the thin mountain air and the lingering effects of the storm. But she persevered. When she was finished, she stood over the simple grave, marked only by a cairn of stones, and spoke her final words to the man who had shaped so much of her life. "I don't forgive you," she said quietly. "I may never forgive you, but I choose not to let hatred for you define the rest of my life. My father was right. There are better ways to honor his memory than through endless vengeance." As she rode away from the cabin, heading back toward the reservation where her people waited, Ayana felt something she hadn't experienced in 15 years, the possibility of peace. Not the peace of the grave, but the peace that comes from choosing to lay down a burden that has grown too heavy to carry. The ghost warrior was riding toward an uncertain future, but for the first time since she was 8 years old, it was a future of her own choosing, not one dictated by the actions of a man who was now nothing more than dust and memory. Behind her, the Colorado mountains stood silent and eternal, keeping their secrets beneath a blanket of fresh snow. And somewhere in the wind that whistled through the pines, the spirit of Nalnish seemed to whisper his approval of his daughter's choice, not for revenge, but for mercy, and for the wisdom to know the difference between justice and healing. The Apache girl who had sworn never to forgive had discovered something more powerful than hatred, the strength to choose her own path forward, even when that path led through the difficult terrain of compassion and grace.